They knew he was coming. The message had arrived at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor at 0300 hours on April 13, 1943. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort's team had been working through the night, as they always did, hunched over worksheets covered in 5-digit number groups. The message was JN-25, the main operational code of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They had been reading it, with varying degrees of success, for months. This particular message was different. It contained what appeared to be an itinerary: specific times, specific locations, specific aircraft types. The codebreakers recognized certain designators they had seen before. RR was Rabaul, the major Japanese base in the South Pacific. Balale was an airfield in the Northern Solomons. And RXZ, that was the designator they had assigned to someone very specific, someone whose movements they had been tracking for over a year. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. The message laid out his inspection tour in precise detail. He would depart Rabaul at 0600 on April 18th. He would fly in a medium bomber, a Mitsubishi G-4M, accompanied by an escort of 6 Zero fighters. He would land at Balale Airfield at 0800 local time. He would inspect the base, meet with commanders, and return to Rabaul that afternoon. The schedule was exact down to the minute. Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, who had worked in the intelligence section long enough to understand the implications, read through the decoded message 3 times. Then he walked it directly to his superior officer. If the information was accurate, if the schedule held, if the Americans could get aircraft in position, they would have roughly 16 hours from the moment of decoding to the moment of interception. 16 hours to plan, approve, and execute an operation to kill the man who had planned Pearl Harbor. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The decision to act would require approval from the highest levels of American command. But before anyone could make that decision, they had to believe the intelligence was real. Japanese operational security had been remarkably tight throughout the war. The notion that Yamamoto's staff would broadcast his exact location and flight schedule seemed almost too convenient. Intelligence officers had learned to be suspicious of information that arrived too easily. The risk of deception was always present, but Station Hypo had been reading Japanese naval codes with increasing accuracy since before Midway. They had proven their capability in June 1942 when they predicted the Japanese attack on Midway Island with such precision that Admiral Nimitz had positioned his carriers perfectly for an ambush. That victory had validated the codebreakers' work. It had also made the intelligence community acutely aware of how valuable this capability was, and how easily it could be compromised if the Japanese discovered their codes were being read. This created a constant tension. Every time American forces acted on decoded intelligence, there was a risk that the Japanese would notice the pattern and change their codes. The codebreakers had to balance the value of the intelligence against the risk of losing future access. Small tactical advantages might be sacrificed to preserve the larger strategic capability, but Yamamoto was not a small tactical advantage. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was 58 years old in April 1943. He had spent his entire adult life in the Imperial Japanese Navy, rising through the ranks based on merit, intellect, and a reputation for strategic thinking that set him apart from his peers. He had served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, studying American industrial, capacity and naval doctrine. He had traveled extensively in the United States, visiting oil fields, factories, and universities. He had attended Harvard briefly and had developed a deep, almost pessimistic understanding of American industrial potential. This understanding had made him one of the few senior Japanese officers who opposed war with the United States. In meetings before Pearl Harbor, He had argued that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict against an opponent with 10 times its industrial capacity. His assessment was coldly mathematical. Japan could achieve early victories through surprise and superior training, but once American production reached full capacity, the material imbalance would become insurmountable. He predicted that Japan might prevail for 6 months, perhaps a year, but not longer. His opposition to the war had not prevented him from planning Japan's opening move. When the decision for war was made by civilian leadership and the emperor, Yamamoto had set aside his reservations and focused on execution. If Japan was going to fight America, the war needed to begin with a decisive blow that would cripple American naval power before it could be brought to bear. The result was the attack on Pearl Harbor, a tactical masterpiece that achieved near-perfect surprise and destroyed much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleship force in a single morning. The attack had made Yamamoto famous, both in Japan and in America. In Japan, he was celebrated as a brilliant strategist who had delivered a stunning victory against a superior opponent. The propaganda machinery praised his daring and vision. His name became synonymous with Japanese naval power. In America, he became the symbol of Japanese treachery, the man who had orchestrated a surprise attack while Japanese diplomats were still negotiating in Washington. His name appeared in newspapers, in radio broadcasts, in political speeches calling for vengeance. But Yamamoto himself understood that Pearl Harbor, for all its tactical success, had failed in its strategic objective. The attack had destroyed battleships, but it had missed the American aircraft carriers, which had been at sea during the attack. Those carriers would become the foundation of American naval power in the Pacific. More critically, the attack had unified American public opinion in a way that no amount of diplomatic pressure could have achieved. The strike that was supposed to demoralize America into a negotiated peace had instead guaranteed total American commitment to Japan's destruction. By April 1943, Yamamoto was living with the consequences of decisions made 16 months earlier. The combined fleet, which he commanded, had suffered a catastrophic defeat at Midway in June 1942. 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk in a single day. The elite naval aviators who had trained for years were dead, their experience and skill irreplaceable. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had shifted to the Americans, who were now advancing through the Solomon Islands toward Rabaul. Yamamoto had moved his headquarters to Rabaul in April 1943 to personally oversee operations in the South Pacific. The base on New Britain was the cornerstone of Japanese defensive positions in the region. From Rabaul, Japanese aircraft could strike at American forces advancing up the Solomons chain. The airfields, harbours, and garrison made it one of the most heavily defended positions in the Japanese Empire outside the home islands. The admiral's presence at Rabaul was meant to inspire the forces there and to signal the importance of holding the position. He met with commanders, reviewed operational plans, and made his presence felt throughout the command structure. But Rabaul was also isolated, vulnerable to American air attack, and increasingly cut off as American forces advanced. Yamamoto needed to visit forward positions, to see conditions firsthand, to make decisions based on direct observation rather than reports filtered through the chain of command. His staff planned the inspection tour with the precision expected of Japanese naval operations. The admiral would visit Balale, Shortland, and Buin, 3 forward airfields in the Northern Solomons. He would assess their defensive capabilities, meet with unit commanders, and deliver morale-boosting speeches to the troops. The tour would take a single day. He would depart Rabaul at first light and return before dark. The staff prepared the itinerary in detail. Departure time, arrival time, aircraft type, escort composition, all were specified. This level of detail was standard practice for high-level visits. Commanders at the destination airfields needed to know when to expect the admiral so they could prepare appropriate ceremonies and have personnel in position. The schedule had to be communicated in advance. The communications staff encoded the itinerary using JN-25, the fleet's main operational code. The code was complex, using a codebook that assigned 5-digit numbers to common words, phrases, and proper names, combined with an additive system that further encrypted the message. Japanese cryptographers believed the system was secure. They had faith in their codes, the same way their tank designers had faith in 12mm armor plate. The faith was based on assumptions about what the enemy could and could not do. Those assumptions were wrong. The Americans had been breaking JN-25 variants since before the war began. The work was difficult, requiring thousands of hours of analysis, pattern recognition, and educated guessing. But it was possible, and by April 1943, Station Hypo had become very good at it. The codebreakers could read perhaps 60 to 70% of intercepted messages, enough to extract operationally useful intelligence, even when some details remained unclear. When the message containing Yamamoto's itinerary was intercepted, it went through the standard workflow. Radio operators at monitoring stations throughout the Pacific picked up the transmission and recorded the 5-digit groups. The intercepts were forwarded to Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, where clerks logged them and passed them to the cryptanalysts. The cryptanalysts worked through the additive system, consulted their partially reconstructed codebooks, and began extracting meaning from the number groups. The process was painstaking. Each 5-digit group had to be looked up, cross-referenced, and evaluated in context. The codebreakers worked with incomplete information, making educated guesses when exact meanings were unclear. But certain designators were well established. They knew RR meant Rabol. They knew what specific number groups indicated aircraft types and times, and they knew that RXZ was the designator for Yamamoto himself. Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes reviewed the decoded message in the early morning hours of April 13th. He understood immediately what it represented. The schedule was specific enough to be actionable. The timing was tight, but feasible. If American fighters could reach the interception point, if the intelligence was accurate, if Yamamoto kept to his schedule, this was an opportunity that would never come again. The man who planned Pearl Harbor would be vulnerable, flying in a lightly armed bomber, predictable in his movements, within range of American air power. The message went up the chain of command with unusual speed. Holmes brought it to Captain Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet intelligence officer, who immediately recognized its significance. Layton took it directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz read through the decoded itinerary, asked several questions about the reliability of the intelligence, and then faced the decision that would define the operation. The strategic value of killing Yamamoto was obvious. He was Japan's most experienced naval commander, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the symbol of Japanese naval power. His death would damage Japanese morale and potentially disrupt their command structure at a critical moment in the Solomons campaign. But acting on the intelligence carried enormous risk. If American fighters appeared at exactly the right time and place to intercept Yamamoto's flight, Japanese intelligence officers might conclude their codes had been compromised. They might change their encryption systems, and the Americans would lose the ability to read Japanese naval communications, an advantage that had already proven decisive at Midway. Nimitz consulted with his intelligence staff. They assessed the risk of compromise. Could the interception be disguised as a chance encounter? Could it be attributed to Coast Watcher reports or aerial reconnaissance rather than signals intelligence? The consensus was that it might be possible if the operation was executed carefully, if the Japanese believed their codes remained secure. If luck held, Nimitz made his decision. The intelligence was too valuable, the target too important. He authorized the operation, but he also sent the decision up to Washington for final approval from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and President Franklin Roosevelt. The authorization came back within hours. The operation was approved at the highest levels of American government. Someone, probably Knox or Roosevelt himself, had made the calculation that killing Yamamoto was worth the risk of potentially compromising the code-breaking operation. The decision reflected both the strategic situation in the Pacific and the personal hatred that Yamamoto's name inspired in American leadership. This was not just about removing a capable enemy commander. This was about vengeance for Pearl Harbor. With authorization secured, the operational planning shifted to Guadalcanal, where the only American fighters with sufficient range to reach the interception point were based. The Army Air Force's 339th Fighter Squadron, equipped with Lockheed P-38 Lightning aircraft, was the only unit that could execute the mission. The P-38 was a distinctive aircraft, a twin-engine, twin-boom design that looked like nothing else in the sky. It was fast, heavily armed, and most importantly for this mission, it had the range to fly from Guadalcanal to the Northern Solomons and back. Major John Mitchell, the operations officer of the 339th, received the mission briefing on the afternoon of April 17th. The briefing was unusual in its specificity. He was told exactly where Yamamoto would be and exactly when he would be there. He was told the aircraft type, the escort composition, the altitude, and the route. He was given a window of opportunity that was measured in minutes, not hours. If his fighters arrived early, they would be spotted and the Japanese would turn back. If they arrived late, they would miss the target entirely. The timing had to be perfect. Mitchell understood the intelligence was extraordinary, though he was not told its source. His job was not to question how the information had been obtained, but to plan a mission that could exploit it. He began working through the details immediately. The flight from Guadalcanal to the interception point near Bougainville was approximately 430 miles over open ocean. The P-38 seconds would have to fly at low altitude to avoid Japanese radar detection, which increased fuel consumption. They would need to navigate precisely without radio communication, which meant dead reckoning over water with no landmarks. They would need to arrive at exactly the right moment, climb to intercept altitude, and engage Yamamoto's flight before the escort could react. The fuel calculations were tight. The P-38G variant, used by the 339th, had an internal fuel capacity of 410 gallons, giving it a range of approximately 450 miles at cruise speed. Mitchell's mission profile required over 860 miles of total flight distance, 430 out and 430 back. The solution was to fit the fighters with external drop tanks, 330-gallon tanks mounted under each wing. With the drop tanks, the P-38 seconds could extend their range to over 1,500 miles, more than enough for the mission. But the drop tanks created their own problems. They were in short supply at Guadalcanal. The squadron had been using them for long-range escort missions and combat air patrol, and the stocks were low. Mitchell needed 18 aircraft for the mission, 16 primary fighters and 2 spares. That meant 36 drop tanks, and the supply depot did not have enough. Mechanics scrounged through storage areas and other units, gathering every serviceable tank they could find. By the evening of April 17th, they had barely enough to equip the mission, aircraft. Mitchell selected his pilots carefully. He needed experienced men who could navigate precisely, maintain formation discipline, and execute the attack without hesitation. He chose 16 pilots from the squadron, dividing them into 3 sections. Mitchell would lead the main formation, maintaining course and altitude to ensure they arrived on time. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber would lead the killer section, 4 aircraft tasked with engaging Yamamoto's bomber. The remaining fighters would provide top cover against the Zero escorts. The navigation planning consumed most of Mitchell's preparation time. He had to plot a course that would bring his formation to the interception point at exactly 0935 local time, the moment when intelligence predicted Yamamoto's aircraft would be descending toward Balale airfield. The course had to account for wind speed and direction, for the reduced speed caused by the heavy drop tanks, for the fuel consumption at low altitude. Mitchell worked through the calculations using maps, charts, and a navigation computer, double-checking every figure. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The final mission brief took place on the morning of April 18th at 0500 hours. Mitchell gathered his pilots in the operations tent and laid out the plan. They would take off at 0710 local time from Fighter, 2 airstrip on Guadalcanal. They would fly northwest at wave-top altitude, below 50 feet, to avoid radar detection. They would maintain radio silence throughout the approach. Navigation would be entirely by dead reckoning and timing. At 0933, they would begin a climb to engage altitude. At 0935, they should intercept 2 Japanese bombers and 6 Zero fighters approaching Balale from the northwest. One of those bombers would be carrying Admiral Yamamoto. The pilots were not told which bomber because the intelligence did not specify. Both bombers would be considered priority targets. Lanphier and Barber's section would go for the bombers. Mitchell's section would engage the Zeros and prevent them from interfering. The mission would last approximately 2.5 hours total flight time. Fuel management would be critical. If anyone had mechanical problems or could not maintain formation, they were to abort and return to base immediately. The pilots asked few questions. They understood the mission was unusual, that the intelligence was specific, that the timing was critical. Some recognized the name Yamamoto from intelligence briefings and news reports. Others simply understood they were going after a high-value target. Mitchell emphasized the need for absolute precision in navigation and timing. If they arrived even 5 minutes late, the Japanese aircraft would be on the ground at Balale, protected by anti-aircraft defenses. If they arrived early, they would be spotted, and the mission would fail. At 0700 hours, the ground crews began starting the P-38 seconds. The Allison V-17 10 engines coughed to life, 12 cylinders per engine, 2 engines per aircraft, 36 engines total across the formation. The sound was thunderous, drowning out conversation. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, strapped in, checked instruments, and tested controls. The drop tanks hung heavy under the wings, nearly scraping the ground. Each aircraft carried over 1,000 pounds of extra fuel, in addition to its internal tanks. Mitchell took off first at 0710 exactly, followed at intervals by the rest of the formation. The P-38 seconds climbed briefly to formation altitude, then descended to wave-top level and turned northwest. Behind them, Guadalcanal disappeared into the haze. Ahead was 430 miles of empty ocean, then the target. The flight was smooth, initially. The formation held together well despite the heavy fuel load. The P-38 seconds cruised at 190 miles per hour, slower than their normal cruise speed because of the drag from the drop tanks. Mitchell checked his navigation constantly, comparing his compass heading to the course he had plotted, watching the clock, calculating their position based on elapsed time and estimated speed. There were no landmarks, just water stretching to the horizon in every direction. At 0800 hours, approximately 50 minutes into the flight, one of the spare aircraft developed engine trouble and turned back. A few minutes later, the second spare also aborted with mechanical problems. Mitchell was down to 16 aircraft, the minimum he had planned for. There were no more spares. If anyone else had problems, the mission would continue without them. The formation continued northwest, skimming the water, maintaining radio silence. The pilots flew on instruments and visual, reference to Mitchell's led aircraft. Time passed slowly. At this altitude, the ocean's surface was a blur beneath the wings. Any mistake, any momentary inattention, could send an aircraft into the water at nearly 200 miles per hour. The pilots stayed focused on their instruments and on maintaining formation position. At 0900 hours, Mitchell began looking for landmarks. According to his navigation plot, they should be approaching the southern coast of Bougainville. Visibility was good, perhaps 10 miles. At 0910, land appeared on the horizon ahead, exactly where Mitchell had calculated it should be. The navigation was perfect. They were on time and on course. The formation turned northeast, following the coast of Bougainville, climbing gradually toward interception altitude. At 0933, Mitchell's formation was at 5,000 feet, approaching the position where intelligence predicted Yamamoto's flight would appear. The pilots scanned the sky, searching for the distinctive silhouette of Mitsubishi G-4M bombers. The tension was palpable. They were committed now, climbing in hostile airspace with Japanese fighters likely nearby. If the intelligence was wrong, if the timing was off, if Yamamoto had changed his schedule, they had just flown 430 miles for nothing and would have to fight their way home through alerted Japanese defenses. Then someone spotted them. 2 G-4M bombers, exactly as predicted, flying at approximately 4,500 feet, descending toward Balale. And above them, 6 Zero fighters in escort formation. The intelligence had been perfect. Yamamoto was there, on schedule, precisely where the decoded message said he would be. Mitchell's formation had 16 hours from the moment of decoding to this moment of contact. They had covered 430 miles of open ocean navigation and arrived within 2 minutes of the predicted interception time. The codebreakers had given them Yamamoto. Now the pilots had to finish the mission. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber broke formation and dove toward the bombers. The 4 P-38 seconds in the killer section dropped their external tanks and pushed their throttles forward, accelerating to attack speed. The Zero escorts above reacted immediately, rolling into defensive positions, but they were caught out of position. The Americans had achieved surprise despite flying into defended airspace. The timing had been too perfect, the approach too low, the climb too sudden for the Japanese to establish an effective defensive perimeter. Lanphier went for the lead bomber. He closed from behind and below, the classic fighter attack position, his twin Browning machine guns and 20mm cannon converging on the G-4M's fuselage. The Mitsubishi G-4M was known to American pilots as the Betty, a twin-engine medium bomber with long range but virtually no armor protection. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A few good hits could turn it into a fireball. Lanphier opened fire at close range, less than 100 yards. His tracers walked up the bomber's fuselage. He saw pieces flying off, saw smoke beginning to stream from the left engine. The G-4M began losing altitude, its left wing dropping. The pilot was trying to maintain control, trying to reach the relative safety of the jungle below rather than crashing into the ocean. Lanphier fired again, another burst that tore into the bomber's tail section and rear fuselage. The G-4M rolled slowly to the left and began a descending spiral. Lanphier pulled up to avoid collision, climbing back toward the furball developing above as the Zeros engaged the American top cover. He watched the bomber go down. It disappeared into the jungle canopy on the west coast of Bougainville, impacting somewhere in the dense vegetation near the village of Aku. There was a column of smoke rising from the crash site within seconds. The bomber had hit hard, with enough, forced to shatter the airframe and scatter debris across several hundred feet of jungle. No parachutes had emerged. If anyone survived the impact, they were in the wreckage. Rex Barber, flying as Lanphier's wingman, had gone after the second G4M. This bomber was slightly behind and to the right of the lead aircraft. Barber approached from the side, firing as he closed. His rounds hit the bomber's right engine and wing root. The G4M tried to evade, turning toward the coast, losing altitude rapidly. Barber followed, firing continuously. He saw his rounds hitting, saw the engine begin trailing heavy smoke, saw the bomber shudder as structural damage accumulated. The second G4M tried to reach Balale airfield, now visible ahead. The pilot was attempting an emergency landing, wheels down, flaps extended, trying to stretch his glide to reach the runway. He almost made it. The bomber cleared the shoreline and crossed onto Balale Island, but it was too low, too slow, and too damaged. It hit the water just offshore from the airfield, impacting hard enough to break the fuselage in half. The wreckage sank within minutes. There were no survivors. Above the crash sites, the dogfight between P-38 seconds and Zeros continued for several more minutes. The American top cover engaged the Japanese escorts, preventing them from interfering with the attack on the bombers. 1-0 was shot down, confirmed crashing into the ocean. The Americans lost no aircraft in the engagement. By 09:45, the P-38 seconds were disengaging, reforming, and heading back toward Guadalcanal. The entire action had lasted less than 10 minutes from first contact to final disengagement. The flight back was tense. The P-38 seconds were deep in Japanese-controlled airspace with fuel running low. They descended back to wave-top altitude and turned southeast, retracing their approach route. Radio silence was maintained until they were well clear of Bougainville. Fuel consumption had been higher than planned due to the PARS, combat maneuvering. Some pilots were watching their gauges nervously, calculating whether they had enough to reach Guadalcanal. All 16 aircraft made it back, landing at Fighter 2 between 11:30 and 11:45 local time. The mission had lasted 4 hours and 35 minutes, almost exactly as Mitchell had planned. The initial debriefing focused on what the pilots had seen. Lanphier and Barber both claimed hits on bombers. Both bombers had been observed going down. The kill section pilots described the engagement in detail, the altitude, the range, the number of bursts fired, the observed damage. Mitchell confirmed that his navigation had been accurate and the interception had occurred exactly on schedule. The intelligence had been perfect. 2 Japanese bombers matching the expected profile had appeared exactly where and when predicted. But which bomber had carried Yamamoto? The pilots did not know. They had engaged both bombers as priority targets. Intelligence had not specified which aircraft the Admiral would be flying in, and the bombers had looked identical from a distance. The confirmation would have to come from other sources, from Coast Watcher reports, from Japanese communications, from reconnaissance of the crash sites. The American command waited for confirmation. The confirmation came within 24 hours. Australian coast watchers on Bougainville, native scouts who operated behind Japanese lines and reported enemy movements by radio, investigated the crash site in the jungle. They found the wreckage of a G4M bomber scattered across the jungle floor. Inside the wreckage, they found bodies. One body, still strapped into a seat, was wearing a dress uniform with insignia indicating flag rank. The body had a sword, an officer's sword of the type carried by senior naval officers. The coast watchers reported their findings by radio. The body was almost certainly Yamamoto. Japanese search. Parties reached the crash site later that same day. They confirmed what the coast watchers had found. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was dead, killed in the crash. His body was recovered and transported back to Rabaul. The official Japanese announcement came on April 21st, 3 days after the attack. Tokyo Radio announced that Admiral Yamamoto had died in combat while directing operations in the forward area. The announcement did not specify that he had been shot down. only that he had died while engaged in combat duties. The Japanese military and civilian leadership were stunned. Yamamoto had been the symbol of Japanese naval power, the architect of early victories, the most recognizable military figure in the empire, aside from the emperor himself. His death was a psychological blow that resonated throughout Japan. The government declared a day of national mourning. Yamamoto's ashes were divided, part interred at a temple in Tokyo, part scattered at sea. He was posthumously promoted to Admiral of the Fleet, the highest rank in the Imperial Navy. American leadership learned of the confirmed kill through intelligence channels before the Japanese public announcement. The news was received with satisfaction at the highest levels. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox informed President Roosevelt personally. The president reportedly expressed pleasure that the operation had succeeded. The decision to authorize the mission, with all its risks to the code-breaking program, had been vindicated. Yamamoto was dead, and the Japanese gave no indication they suspected their codes had been compromised. The codebreakers at Station Hypo monitored Japanese communications closely in the days following the attack, watching for any sign that the Japanese suspected signals intelligence had enabled the interception. They saw nothing suspicious. Japanese communications continued using JN-25 without modification. The security procedures remained unchanged. The Japanese appeared to believe the interception had been either a chance encounter or the result of routine aerial reconnaissance, not a precisely planned ambush based on decoded communications. This was the outcome American intelligence had hoped for, but it was not guaranteed. The precision of the interception, the fact that American fighters had appeared at exactly the right time and place, should have raised suspicions. But several factors worked in favor of maintaining the deception. First, the Americans had been conducting regular long-range fighter patrols in the Northern Solomons for weeks. P-38 flights over Bougainville were not unusual. Second, coast watchers were known to be operating in the area, and the Japanese knew these scouts could report aircraft movements. Third, the American fighters had come from below and behind, suggesting they had been on patrol at low altitude and climbed to intercept a target of opportunity. The Japanese conducted an investigation into the loss. Staff officers at Rabaul reviewed the security procedures for Yamamoto's trip. They questioned whether the itinerary should have been broadcast in advance, whether the timing should have been more flexible, whether the route should have been varied. But they did not conclude that American codebreakers had read the schedule. Instead, they attributed the loss to inadequate fighter escort, to the vulnerability of the G-4M bomber, to the operational hazards of flying in contested airspace. The possibility that their most secure naval code had been compromised did not receive serious consideration. This failure of Japanese intelligence to recognize the compromise was a remarkable piece of luck for the Americans. The code-breaking advantage, which had been risked to kill Yamamoto, remained intact. Station Hypo and other Allied signals intelligence units continued reading Japanese naval communications for the rest of the war. The intelligence derived from these intercepts influenced every major naval operation in the Pacific from April 1943 until Japan's surrender in August 1945. The strategic value of maintaining this capability far exceeded the value of killing any single enemy commander, even one as significant as Yamamoto. The question of whether killing Yamamoto actually mattered strategically has been debated by historians for decades. His death did not change Japan's fundamental strategic situation in the Pacific. The industrial imbalance remained. American production capacity continued to outpace Japanese capacity by ratios of 10-to-1 or higher in critical categories. The island-hopping campaign continued on schedule. Japanese defensive positions fell one after another, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa to Saipan to the Philippines to Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Would any of this have been different if Yamamoto had survived? The consensus among historians is probably not. Yamamoto was a capable commander, but he was not irreplaceable. The officers who succeeded him were competent professionals who faced the same impossible strategic situation. Japan could not win a prolonged war against American industrial power, regardless of who commanded the combined fleet. Yamamoto himself had predicted this before Pearl Harbor. His death in April 1943 may have accelerated Japanese decline slightly, may have reduced Japanese operational effectiveness at the margins, but it did not fundamentally alter the trajectory of the war. What the operation did achieve was psychological impact. For the Americans, killing Yamamoto was symbolic revenge for Pearl Harbor. It demonstrated that no Japanese commander, no matter how senior or how carefully protected, was beyond reach. It showed that American intelligence capabilities were formidable, even if the Japanese did not fully recognize how formidable. And it provided a morale boost at a time when the Pacific War was still grinding through its bloody island campaigns, with ultimate victory far from certain. For the Japanese, Yamamoto's death was demoralizing in ways that transcended his operational role. He had been the symbol of Japanese naval power from the opening moments of the war. His loss suggested that Japan was losing not just battles but the irreplaceable leaders who had planned and executed early victories. The propaganda value of his survival, the image of the brilliant admiral directing operations from forward bases, was replaced by the reality of a state funeral and official mourning. The psychological shift was subtle but real. The pilots who flew the mission became minor celebrities in the American military, though the full details of the operation remained classified for years. Thomas Lanphier was officially credited with shooting down Yamamoto's bomber, though Rex Barber disputed this claim for the rest of his life. The controversy over who actually fired the fatal shots became a bitter debate that outlasted the war itself. Both men had engaged bombers. Both bombers had gone down. The precise attribution of kills in aerial combat is often unclear, but in this case, the ambiguity was compounded by the high-profile nature of the target. What is not ambiguous is the success of the mission as planned. Major John Mitchell's navigation was nearly perfect, bringing his formation to the interception point within minutes of the scheduled time after 430 miles of overwater flight. The intelligence provided by the codebreakers was flawless, predicting Yamamoto's location and timing with precision that enabled the ambush. The decision to risk the code-breaking program to kill one man, controversial at the time and debated since, achieved its immediate objective without compromising the larger intelligence capability. 16 hours from decoded message to interception, a window of opportunity that opened and closed in the time it took to plan a single mission. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.